Even though he wasn't hidden away and taught to fear the outside world like Elsa, Kristoff had one of the saddest backstories in the entire Frozen franchise. Disney didn't spend much time digging into his origin throughout either of the Frozen films, but the few details that they did give viewers, along with interviews from the creators, paint a clear picture of Kristoff's history. In fact, Kristoff's connection to his reindeer Sven might be one of the only things that the character had to indicate where he came from. But no matter how it's painted, it's clear that Kristoff's origins can only be described as heartbreaking. Kristoff was introduced at the very beginning of Frozen, and even though he looked happy and cheerful, he was only making the best of a tragic situation. The first movie hinted at Kristoff's mysterious origin at the very beginning of the movie when he was shown working alongside the ice harvesters as a child. During this scene, it's clear that Kristoff is working with them, granted at a much smaller scale. But what's not clear is which one of the adults was supposed to be his parent. It looked like the harvesters were working around the child rather than watching over him, and then when it was time for the workers to head out, they all loaded up their large sled and basically left Kristoff behind. This was Disney's first time showing us that Kristoff was on his own from a very young age. The only true companion that he ever had was his trusty reindeer Sven, but beyond that, he was an orphan who didn't have a family. Another strong indicator that Kristoff wasn't truly one of the ice harvesters, aside from working with them as they worked, was the fact that while he used a reindeer to pull his tiny sled, the adults used horses. And while this might look like a small detail on the surface, Sven being a reindeer is actually a really strong hint at where Kristoff came from and who his people were. Kristoff explained to Anna in the first movie that for basically his entire life, it was only ever him and Sven against the world. He told her that it wasn't until the trolls took them in that he had some semblance of family. And in Frozen 2, Disney gave viewers more information about the world around Arendelle, which inadvertently added more details to help fans explore and even theorize about Kristoff's depressing origin and how he ended up an orphan in the first place. The second Frozen introduced the people of Northuldra, who happened to be based on the same culture that Kristoff's character was inspired by. According to Kristoff's original character description for the first movie, he was a Sami outdoorsman that worked as an ice harvester. This tracks, especially when you consider the part of the world that Arendelle was based on, which is Scandinavia. In reality, the Sami are the indigenous people in that portion of the world, and they are known for raising and herding reindeer. And the fact that Kristoff was described as being a Sami outdoorsman is huge, because despite him being an orphan, his lineage was now strongly connected to the people of Northuldra. When Frozen 2 came out, the creators revealed that their inspiration behind the tribespeople of Northuldra was none other than the Sami. In fact, as a result of an agreement between the Sami parliaments of Finland, Norway, and Sweden, as well as the Walt Disney Company and the Transnational Sami Council, Disney consulted with people belonging to Sami culture in order to create the tribe in their movie. Now, despite being an orphan who never really knew his family, Kristoff found out that he had a lot in common with the Northuldrans. Not only do they all seem to have the same sort of large nose that Kristoff had, but the similarities between Kristoff's clothes and the clothes worn by the Northuldrans were almost immediately recognizable. But it doesn't stop there. Frozen 2 also showed us that, like the Sami, the Northuldrans show the same amount of love for reindeer as Kristoff had for Sven. He and Ryder even bonded over this connection and talked about the fact that they could understand what the animal was thinking just by looking at them. That being said, throughout the entire sequel to Frozen, it's never mentioned that Kristoff came from Northuldra or even knew who they were in the first place. But that doesn't mean that his ancestry doesn't trace back to them, though. All it means is that Kristoff's childhood was a lot darker than it was initially perceived, especially knowing that he was separated from the only people that seemed to fully understand him and his quirks. Now, it's hard not to wonder why Kristoff wasn't trapped in the forest with the rest of the Northuldrans and soldiers from Arendelle, but after understanding more about the Sami people and considering the time of year that the mist fell on the forest, the picture becomes a lot clearer. In Frozen 2, it was explained that a mysterious mist fell on the forest around Northuldra, trapping anyone who was inside and preventing them from aging. Well, if it was able to trap an entire tribe plus the army that was attacking them, then it's likely that the barrier worked both ways, and until it was disturbed by Elsa in Frozen 2, also kept intruders out of the forest. Well, if Kristoff's family was away from the tribe at the time of the mist's descent, then they easily would have been trapped on the outside and away from their people. This would be the first of many hardships that the young Kristoff would face as an orphan. Before getting into how Kristoff or his family got left outside of the mist, it's important to note that the time of year that Northuldrans were trapped inside of the forest. After watching the scene of Frozen 2 depicting the battle between the Northuldrans and Arendelle, it's clear that the ground was covered in grass and there was no snow in sight, which indicated that that battle likely took place in the spring or summer. Well, in real-life Scandinavia around that time, the reindeer and the Sami who take care of them take part in what's known as a reindeer herd migration. This is a common practice that takes place during the summer and involves the Sammy herding large groups of reindeer into fields that would typically be covered in snow, allowing them to graze and receive nourishment. This brings us back to Kristoff, or rather his family, who was never actually introduced. Considering the fact that Kristoff had his own pet reindeer from childhood, it's likely that his parents were some of the people who worked really closely with the animals and most likely assisted the reindeer on their migration during the warmer season, meaning they were away from the forest during the time of the battle, and when they returned after the mist had consumed the place, Kristoff's family was essentially locked out. But as mentioned before, this was just the beginning of a life of hardship for Kristoff, since by the time he was shown working with the ice harvesters, the child clearly had no parents. That means that something must have happened to them along the way, leaving Kristoff as an orphan. After doing some more research and looking at other sources, it's starting to look like even if Kristoff had grown up with his family, he likely would have only had a mother. Frozen 2 showed the Northuldrans as the sort of people who have learned to survive off the land, meaning that Kristoff's parents should have had no trouble surviving away from their tribe. However, that clearly wasn't the case, because Kristoff would end up without a family shortly after being born, which, according to the timelines of both Frozen movies, couldn't have been long after the mist settled around the forest. Now, living on their own away from the tribe would have been hard enough for Kristoff's family if he had both of his parents with them, but after reading the novel Frozen 2: Dangerous Secrets, the story of Iduna and Agnar, it looks like there's a chance that Kristoff's father was gone before the child was even born. You see, in the book it was revealed that during their youth, but after the mist had fallen over the forest, Iduna and Prince Agnar traveled to Troll Valley, which is where readers were briefly introduced to a woman that could easily have been seen as Kristoff's mother. When Iduna and Agnar arrived at the valley, the trolls were talking to a blonde woman who was pregnant at the time and was described as being an ice harvester. In the book, it's also explained that the woman was visiting the trolls to grieve the tragic loss of her husband and the father of her unborn child. This has led to theories speculating that this woman was Kristoff's mother, and in all honesty, it lines up really well. If Kristoff's family had gotten locked out of the forest, it's likely that they would have needed to find other means of surviving, and for them, that meant becoming ice harvesters. But as the book mentioned, the pregnant woman was grieving the loss of her husband, which meant she would have to raise the child on her own. One of the trolls used their powers to erase the woman's memory, which would explain why Kristoff never learned about the people of Northuldra or any stories of where he came from, because his mother had no stories to share. Sadly though, even if she did, we know from Kristoff's brief backstory that his mother wouldn't have had long to share the stories with him before he was tragically left an orphan. This also lines up with the idea that Kristoff was connected to the magical trolls and explains why they wanted to take him in and raise them in the first place. Not only did they possibly know Kristoff's mother, but it also falls in line with Sami culture. You see, the Sami people believe that everything, living or not, has a soul inside of it. That includes rocks and stones, which is exactly what the trolls were made of. Kristoff was certainly a character with a mysterious backstory that seemed like it could only be based on tragedy, and the more connections found between his character and the people of Northuldra only solidify that concept. What do you think though? Will we ever actually learn where Kristoff came from? Make sure you let us know in the comments below.